We good?
You're all set.
All right. So welcome to the lunchtime information session for the Title 21 parking and site access amendments to the Title 21 zoning ordinance. And this is a session where if you're a member of the AIA, the Anchorage Home Builders, and the ASLA, I believe that the chapters have arranged for members to receive continuing learning credits for this. So if you're here in person, please do sign in. And if you are online, we will make sure through the meeting recording to make sure that we get your name to those chapters so that you can receive credit. We're going to basically break this into two parts. We'll take a break in the middle, but the first part will cover the first major set of amendments that the Assembly adopted to our off-street parking standards. Then in the last half after break, we will cover the amendments that the Assembly adopted to the driveway access standards and pedestrian frontage standards in these ordinances. There'll be time for questions at the end of the off-street parking section before a break. And again, at the end of each of the driveway and pedestrian sections. Please mute your mic in the meantime. And we have a couple of folks here who are watching the meeting to see if there are questions coming through on the chat, or if you are raising your hand through Microsoft Teams. If you are patching in by phone, we will, at the end of the questions, make sure that we ask if there's anyone patching in by phone that needs to ask their question verbally. We're going to cover the major substantive change to the Title 21 zoning ordinance, the items that change entitlements for what can be developed on the site and the design of the development site and the approval procedure. So we are covering what's changing. There's a whole lot in Title 21 that isn't changing, but in each of these sections, we'll cover a number of 4 or 5 most important topics. These are a pair of amendments to Title 21 that have gone through a several-year public process. In 2022, the parking ordinance affecting your off-street parking requirements was broken off by the Assembly. Apart from, in the bright blue, the site access amendments. And the parking was adopted in 2022, and the site access shown on the screen continued on for its own journey. So when the parking amendments were adopted in late 2022, we adopted big reforms to our off-street parking minimums, our parking space size dimensional standards, and some other development standards for parking. And that became effective earlier this year. In that first ordinance, we also adopted reforms to our bicycle parking standards. So off-street bicycle rack requirements, as well as a menu of incentives to encourage folks to get to your sites by alternative means besides driving their car. Those pieces of the first ordinance become effective on January 1. They were adopted a while ago. They become effective on January 1, 2024, along with the rest of the site access amendments ordinance. The site access amendments ordinance was adopted about 4 or 5 months ago, and it becomes effective on January 1, 2024. So the purpose of this presentation is for us in the planning department to help you become prepared for the changes that become effective in 2024. A little bit about us, the team that worked on this project in the planning department is myself, Tom Davis, in Long Range Planning Division, and Elizabeth Appleby in the current planning division. We were with a multi-agency team, some with whom are online, and also worked a lot with other agency partners. Also here with us is Ryan Yella, the Long Range Planning Division Manager, who is watching the chat in the meeting and will be helping us, making sure that if you have a question, you get it answered. The ordinance are available on the project webpage and on the Title 21 webpage of the planning department here shown in a clip in an image here. The Title 21 webpage shows the currently adopted amendments that are in effect today. So you find that the parking amendments are already in that code and they're in effect. That code does not yet show people what Title 21 will look like on January 1 with the site access amendments. So very soon here, we're going to put a version of the code available on the Title 21 webpage, which shows you, gives you the preview of what Title 21 will look like. So definitely when you're going online, look for Title 21, go to the planning department webpage, not Municode. Go to Municode for all the rest of the municipal code chapters. But for Title 21, keep visiting our Title 21 webpage. Just a couple of related projects. These were two of the largest ordinances that we've amended Title 21 with since for about 10 years. And there are some technical corrections, clarifications need to be made. There are some gaps that were created, some in the code. And so there is a cleanup amendments ordinance that is going forward to attempt to make those corrections and close those gaps. And that is going forward to the assembly very shortly here. And our goal is to get that adopted as quickly as possible so that you're not fuddling around with, poor table references or other things that don't make sense. So that cleanup amendment includes several substantive changes proposed to try to deal with some unintended consequences and some gaps. Where we show something today, for example, some standard or requirement that's adopted and amended and adopted, if there is proposed a substantive change to that, you will see the wrench and the screwdriver and this amendment proposed in red pop up. And we'll briefly cover that with you so you're aware of those. But that ordinance, that cleanup ordinance should become available as soon as the assembly introduces it. We're hoping later this month. So one of the challenges of removing parking minimums is that Anchorage hasn't spent the last 50 years preparing to manage on-street parking. But here we are, we're at the cusp of shifting from the top picture on the left, which was focusing on making sure private property owners provided the parking individually in a rather wasteful land use pattern, to on-street parking management. And so the municipality is going to conduct several studies and prepare a strategy for how the municipality is going to better manage parking behavior so it's not interfering with the pedestrians. And equally important, how we're going to manage street maintenance and street design to make our streets work as complete streets all year round for pedestrians, parkers, and street maintenance so we can get through the snow. That project is just getting underway. We will see a web page and a project pop up here in several months. The Assembly funded that project, and it also funded a related project called the Spinard Road Corridor Parking Management Study. So we have a parking management study for the citywide, one that's focused on Spinard, and a large study focusing on our winter maintenance strategy so that we are able to improve how we manage parking on street. Change how we do business. Before we move into the main part of the presentation today, we're just going to do a quick policy recap, why we did this parking amendment. Off-street parking minimums requiring a certain amount of parking spaces and site access standards determining our driveway sizes, where our driveways are on site, and how our pedestrians get to the buildings. These are in the land use code, but they touch on all kinds of different initiatives throughout the city. Certainly, it is at the nexus between land use and transportation. So we are really influencing our transportation system through what our codes have emphasized on site, and certainly impacts on the cost of housing and other development and just how our city operates. So does Title 21 match, support our policy plans? So for the past 50 years, Title 21 has required generally more parking than most people need most of the time on each site. That has led to induce people to drive because it makes the city more convenient for us drivers than it does for those of us who are walking. It's induced a development pattern that reinforces itself. The goal of this project is to get away from that situation and move in a new direction. There's going to be a lot of information on these slides, and we will post this show on the webpage and a recording on the webpage. This project is about shifting how we achieve the goal there at the top in blue, access between land uses. Title 21 historically is really focused on one particular method there at the very bottom in gray. We are, through our plans and land use amendments, looking at different ways to help people access where they need to go. But in this ordinance, we are really looking at shifting towards making sure that pedestrians and bicyclists can as conveniently get onto the site as people driving their car. And looking at different ways to address parking through strategies that affect how much parking gets utilized. And as part of the decision of how much parking to provide, to focus on private market determining how much parking to provide off-site. So this is a shift in Title 21. So there is an emphasis you'll see in these amendments to improve our site access standards for pedestrians. And it comes down to making it easier to develop the kinds of development that we want to see in this town by right. We're going to cover the first set of amendments. And these deal with off-street motor vehicle parking. The purpose of the parking section in Title 21 is worth reading. The way Title 21 works is you can first look at the purpose statement of any given section and get the general gist of why it's there, what it's there for. And the purpose of the off-street parking requirements is to regulate our parking lots and parking facilities. With this amendment, we've removed the objective in the code to ensure that there is adequate parking. That's no longer the job of this code. The job of the code is now to ensure that our parking lots work, they're safe, and they minimize impacts on the landscaping, walkways, neighboring uses, and our other objectives. So we're managing impacts. The parking section, with these amendments, now applies to downtown Anchorage. It did not quite do completely before. Downtown had some of its own dimensional standards. We've amended a few standards in what you are required to submit to demonstrate compliance. First of all, there were some scattered submittal requirements in other subsections. We've put it all under this parking facility design plan section. In that section, we have also exempted 3 and 4 plexes from a lighting engineering plan requirement that was expensive and kind of over the top for them. So developing 3 and 4 plexes no longer required lighting engineering plans. This is basically the outline and not actually much shorter than the actual section of minimum parking requirements, which used to contain a very long table of parking minimums. But it's really down to a sentence. Off-street parking spaces are not required, except that there are certain kinds of parking or vehicle loading that are actually still required. The accessible ADA parking spaces, passenger loading zones, bicycle parking spaces. We'll get to several of these. And then in addition, if an area will be used for automobile parking, if it is being used or will be used, it is considered parking. And so the municipality will want you to construct that area to meet parking facility design standards. Important for us to make sure that if there is parking going on, it's being a parking area, that it's buffered, meets ADA standards, surface, takes care of water quality treatment, stormwater management, and managing the other impacts of parking facilities. That's a bit different from the previous Title 21, which focused its design standards on required parking. But now that there's no required parking, we anticipated, we're beginning to see situations where folks don't necessarily think of or plan or show their areas as parking, but that's where they are. So the first cleanup amendments that we'll cover today briefly is that we, in the cleanup ordinance going to the assembly that I mentioned earlier, there is a clarification about that if you have a site and you have some areas of the site that maybe aren't shown as parking, that if they have the curb cuts, if they're attached to the parking area or the driveway, that we want those areas to meet the design standards for parking, so that when the cars are go there, that the parking facility is meeting the standards and minimizing impacts. So we're no longer there for you. You actually have to decide how much parking yourselves to provide. And what we've learned in our parking studies is that in a lot of cases, we see sites, we see it with our own eyes. We've gone out middle of the night, Sunday night, residential parking facility, and the cars just really aren't there. Or maybe it's a third full. It's overparked. We're going to provide what we can of local parking studies that we have done or are aware of on the Municipal Planning Department webpage. We're completing a few parking studies of residential uses and commercial uses in Spinard and make those available. But we really encourage folks to explore the possibilities because we think that unless you really are focused on that, that you could be leaving a lot of land and money on the table for your development if you overpark. Current parking behavior isn't necessarily mean that's what people will always need that much parking. I won't go through them, but there are a number of strategies that you can take that have been shown to reduce the amount of parking you need on your site in order to achieve your objectives for your development. And to get the same result, for example, shared parking agreements and offsite parking agreements, most popular in Anchorage, but there are also some other strategies. We call it unbundled parking, where you actually price parking separately for rent. These can incentivize folks to decide to get to the site in other ways. And advocate to your assembly member in that last bullet to increase our investments in public transportation, public investments in sidewalks. These investments are an investment in yourselves, and that they will create an environment where you can provide less parking as citywide. Accessible parking space requirements, the first of the several remaining requirements for off-street parking that I mentioned. We'll just cover those briefly because the ordinance made an amendment to the amount required. And I'll just provide you the information and we can, at the question and answer break, we can cover any questions you have about this. But the federal requirement, of course, we did change that. The amount of accessible spaces are required. But the municipality added to that requirement. We now, even for small parking lots, are required to provide an accessible space. And for larger parking lots, 11 or more spaces, essentially doubled the number of ADA spaces required. And that is in effect. The traffic engineering department and staff administering this for the past 8 months have asked that we move forward with a couple of amendments. One of which is there's a very awkward situation where the federal requirement, as always, has no grandfather rights. Every parking lot in the city, no matter how old it is, needs to provide the ADA spaces. It's very difficult to explain why there's legal non-conforming rights for one piece of it and not for the other. So we recommend a pair of amendments to make the remove all legal non-conforming rights, including from the municipal required spaces, which on the face of it might seem difficult because that would technically make every parking lot in the city non-conforming illegally. But the second one is that the traffic engineer has the ability to reduce or remove the municipal parking spaces required. So here in the chart, in the bright blue on the right-hand side, you see the added municipal requirement, and in the far right column, the total of the two. So it's that bright blue, the ones with the plus signs that are in play here. Another major amendment is to the parking space dimensions. And the current adopted standard is that it resulted from the amendments is essentially that in most multifamily and commercial districts, you're really looking at an 18-foot long stall, 18-footer. And some other zoning districts, the single family, the rural, semi-rural, and incidentally Girdwood, that's the standard. It's still the 20-foot stall. The interplay between the amendments, it got a little complicated and there's some unintended consequences. We are recommending to simplify the standard by merging the standard size and small size, so that instead of an 18 and 20 foot, which varies by zoning district, that we just settle on one size, 19 feet long, based on some research regarding our actual vehicle fleet size. And that would look a bit like that lower table. So you'd have a 19-foot standard. So that's proposed in the cleanup amendments that will be going to the assembly. So we believe the parking stall space dimensions might still be in play. 19 feet, 20 feet, that doesn't really, why are we doing that? We're playing around with 1 foot. When you have a large parking lot, every amount of space counts. And the total goal of both ordinances and this cleanup amendment is to reduce the parking stall size as much as practical while still accommodating the vehicles. So that they are not overhanging into walkways, overhanging into landscaping, overhanging into sidewalks and rights of way. So we do care about accommodating vehicles so to mitigate their impacts. The 19-foot stall doesn't, for lack of a better term, pander to the dual cab pickups. It's a bit smaller than the 20-foot stall, but we find that it's the least worst, or kind of in the Goldilocks zone of accommodating most of our standard vehicles in town, whether it's, like a small pickup or a sedan. There are two parts of the parking amendments adopted in the ordinance last year that have yet to become effective. They become effective in January. One is that larger developments will be required to select from a menu of incentives for reducing parking utilization on their site. Some of those strategies I mentioned earlier. These are intended to reduce costs, reduce congestion and parking conflicts between neighbors as we move away from off-street minimums, taking care of those kinds of problems, moving towards having the right-of-way management and off-street, the developers pitch in to help us reduce this land area costs, assist walking and bicycling, and head off neighbor-to-neighbor conflicts. So the applicability is to larger developments, be the larger multifamily developments, 20 units or more, and commercial, non-residential developments, 20,000 square feet gross floor area or more. Exemptions would be for affordable housing units. That will have affordable housing unit as part of your project. That unit is not counted, same with the senior housing. And for all existing developments, we have the non-conforming rights. So that comes into play. This standard is non-discretionary. It's part of your by right permit. It's not a separate review process. You have the information. We'll have information on Title 21 webpage there below the table. It's not an extra process beyond the by right permit process. The other requirement that is yet to become effective is an amendment to our bicycle parking requirement, which has been in Title 21 for about 10 years, but we are reforming it, and it becomes effective in January 1. A bicycle parking space, what is a bicycle parking space? It is a 2x6 space, generally, not always. That includes a bike rack. So there you see a standard 2 bike U rack. That bike rack accommodates 2 bike parking spaces. So for most uses, 2 bicycle parking spaces will be required on January 1. Sort of gives you a visual of what one way that might look like. And it applies to most commercial, institutional, and multi-unit residential projects. The 2-space minimum increases with the size of development. So the way it works is that as your development gets over a certain size, it gradually begins to add spaces at a relatively low rate, but it does get proportional to the size of your development. So in the left-hand column, you see a list of your Title 21 use types. These are your familiar defined use types and categories in Chapter 5 of Title 21. So you just connect to your use. In the middle column, besides your 2-space requirement, the number of spaces increases with the size of your development. So depending on what kind of development is, what type of use, it may increase a little bit or at a higher rate. So there you see that in the middle column. And then for these developments, a percentage of those, some of those required bicycle parking spaces are required to be what we call long-term bike space. Long-term isn't like airport parking. It's really for commuters that have to stay at the site for their whole work shift, or it's residents who park their bike overnight, they live there, or students at school. Long-term bike parking is more than a couple hours visiting the school. So a certain percentage of the additional required spaces beyond the first 2, we are asking be long-term bike spaces. We'll cover what that means. First of all, any dwelling unit with its own garage is exempt, as are some other use types, mostly use types without a lot of people on site. A couple of other partial exceptions, one being this last bullet, that long-term bike parking spaces requirement doesn't apply to your townhouse style development, and it doesn't apply to 3 and 4-plex buildings. Those buildings are exempt. So no long-term bike parking requirement for those small multifamily use types. We also have trending in Title 21 is the ability to reduce administratively as part of your permit review. So you're not having to go to variance, you're not having to argue to a board, and relief, common sense relief for situations can be provided just as part of your land use permit review. No fee required. You just have to demonstrate no space, it won't work. There was a bicycle parking space requirement before. It hasn't been in effect since we adopted the ordinance, but it required bicycle parking of larger developments. But some of the smaller and medium-sized developments haven't had a bicycle parking requirement before. For example, a 20-plex apartment building would, of course, you'd have your minimum of 2 spaces required. But now you also have this 1 space is required per 5 dwellings. So that comes out to 4 bike parking spaces required. So a minimum of 2. If this were a 10-plex, even 10 divided by 5 would be 2 spaces. So those 2 spaces would be required. So as the number of multifamily units increases over 10, you start to accrue more bike parking spaces. So 4 bike spaces, as we mentioned, is 2 standard bike racks. But we also have that long-term space requirement. I won't go to the details here, but this slide will be available to you, in the version of this available online or in the paper copy for those of you. So it happens that for the residential, that 3 out of 4 of those additional spaces beyond the 2 are required to be long-term spaces. So how do you calculate that? How many long-term spaces do we have? So you deduct those first 2 required bike parking spaces from your total of 4. Your total of 4 spaces required, deduct those first 2. And the long-term space requirement applies to those last 2 spaces. 75% of 2 rounded up or rounded the closest whole number, 2 spaces. So in this development, you can imagine 4 spaces required, 1 bike rack in front or somewhere, and then 2 spaces long term. Long-term space requirement does not apply to townhouse style buildings or fourplex buildings. This development happens to have both fourplex buildings in the townhouse style, so there is no long-term space requirement. There are not enough units to require more than 2 bike spaces, a bike rack. Most buildings in town are existing buildings, and you might be modifying those buildings. This slide and the next slide cover what happens in those cases, but the long and short of it is that because of legal non-conforming rights, in a lot of cases, you're not going to see your development on existing sites and buildings being required to provide more bicycle parking. This is a great slide to go back and review and read, but essentially Title 21, even if the property doesn't have the spaces, Title 21, it treats the property as if the 2 required bike spaces already exist. There are cases where a change of use or a dramatic building expansion will increase the bicycle parking requirement from what it was before. And so so this slide covers that, and I will avoid going into it. If we want to ask, I can go back to the slide. But basically, if it increases the bike parking requirement above what it was before, the development will be asked to provide the spaces that account for that increase. So the total requirement for the development would be 4 spaces in this case. Up from the original 2, the development would only be asked to include the last 2 spaces. Bicycle facility design. The section looks long, but I think that it's really not. It's really clarifying and improving on the standard that has already been in Title 21. A bike space, wherever it is, has a rack, or it's in its own lock. So wherever it is, if it's in a room, if it's in a sheltered area, it's long-term, short-term, it has a rack, or it's in its own bike locker. There are dimensional standards in this tiny photograph. It does call out certain size, height, so that it can support the bike. But it accommodates, as shown in the photo, a variety of bicycle rack designs. They don't have to be standard. So we have the well-designed Spinard racks, and they would meet the standard. The rack in the background would not meet the standard in that photo. So. In the old standard, we required the bicycle to be a certain distance, within a certain distance of the main entrance. That has gone away, and it's really more flexible. As long as people can see it, or there's wayfinding signage to it, it can be located in other areas in the site. The main thing is that it's easy to get to and it's functional. So in all Title 21, a space was 2 feet 6 inches wide, and that was it. This, this amendment adds a bunch of options, by right options for wall mounted spaces and other configurations. It doesn't try to cover everything. It further gives the planning department the ability to approve other configurations that you might think of that, of course, we in Title 21 did not. So there's a lot more variety allowed here. The benefit being that some of these take up a lot less space than your standard stall size. This amendment also takes more care, pays more attention to clearance around the bicycle parking space, making sure that people can get into it, get out of it without getting in the way of walkways and other things. The first bullet under item 3, the clear aisle needs to be 5 feet, but that can be inclusive of your required walkway. So you have a 5-foot required walkway to your front door. You can overlap that with your, the clear aisle behind your row of bike spaces. That whole origami effect of removing more and more space from your developable area doesn't impact you there. You're basically can double use that 5-foot clear aisle space. So long-term bicycle parking space, getting to the end of the parking section in general here. The long-term bicycle parking space is, it's in a room or it's in the left-hand lower picture, some kind of exterior enclosure. The one here at the A&MC campus. And that space is sheltered from the weather. Doesn't have to be entirely enclosed, but it's, has a roof. It's sheltered from the snow, the rain. And it is accessible to all the employees or all your residents. So it's a common use area. Nobody else can get in, right? That's the idea. And it's accessible. So it's not a space that people store in their individual dwellings or in their individual offices. It's a common use area. And the purpose there is that it's used more efficiently. Requiring use spaces, we want them to be available. They're not scrolled up in an area that if it's not being used, no one else can use it. Many residents will keep their bikes in their apartments. We understand that. This bike parking requirement in Title 21 is really, since you can think of it as supplementing, providing space that's accessible to all. So, first of all, do we have folks that have any questions? Then we could take a 5-10 minute break. So, yes, go ahead.
I see bicycle. What about motorcycles?
All right. So what about motorcycles? Why aren't we accommodating motorcycles? So we've seen a few towns that have motorcycle parking requirements. We're focusing on the bicycle to I think it's more the human power, the pedestrian type way of traveling. So we didn't prioritize figuring out parking for motorcycles. It gets a little more into closer to automobile parking. That's the best answer I can provide. We didn't spend a lot of time thinking about it.
There were some questions from the chat. I'll just go through a couple of them. So we were asked where the increased requirement for the accessible spaces came from. That was in the S version of the original parking and driveways ordinance that the assembly introduced. I believe they had talked to some community members who wanted to see that, and they added it in the S version. This one I think was just answered in the slide that you just showed, Tom. Someone had asked about indoor bike parking, offsetting any exterior long-term bike parking, and in general, yes, because the long-term bike parking, it's meant to be an enclosed, secure space, so it could very well be within something. And then there's just some discussion on code enforcement for people parking in ADA spaces when they don't actually have the ADA sticker. Comment on some complexity in the code. Those are the gist of what's going on in the chat.
Okay. I believe the Assembly's rationale for the ADA increase had to do with now that we're not requiring parking and there be fewer spaces, the ADA parking itself will shrink, or in some cases might go away. And so there was a concern expressed to Assembly member by someone who advocates for those of us who have a disability to make sure that we are reducing access for folks who are disabled by inadvertently by moving on site parking. And in Anchorage, we don't have great ADA access in a lot of cases from the street and sidewalk. And so they depend on being able to get on site. That was the rationale. Yes.
What was the discussion around the need for a room sheltering the school as opposed to just a occupants?
So what is the rationale for requiring the long-term bike parking to be sheltered?
Well, I understand the rationale, I think, but was there discussion over whether that is ultimately necessary to provide some of the adequate accommodation?
Whether the sheltering was necessary?
Yeah, or required.
Oh, to require the sheltering for the roof specifically, or?
Yeah, but, well, I was on the line recently, was working on that, had a fenced area, right, or community over there. It was well used, and so I'm just wondering if that was discussed at length, given the, once you stick a roof on it, we're talking about engineering and snow loads and possibly the extension of the building as opposed to the fence.
Yeah, right. So yeah, that is an additional expense. For the long-term spaces, I think we were coming at it from the perspective of making it as practical, convenient as we could for people who might be using the space, for people to bicycle. And we really are trying to prime the pump on the field, so to speak, and try to make the city more welcoming to bicycling in general. And I think there's a lot of efforts going on in the public right-of-way realm to accommodate bikes better, but also to make it workable. I think big cities have found that another major factor is to make sure there's bike parking available. So long-term, you can imagine it might be only a work shift. Maybe at the end of the day, someone will go back to their bike and find it's got a lot of snow on it, or it's been out in the rain. But you can also imagine it being someone storing their bike in their residence for multiple days. So the idea being that it's sheltered from the elements and the wear and tear of the snow, everything else that has to do being out in the open. So that was the sort of the trade-off there.
There's one more question in the chat. Genevieve, we can see your hand is up.
I can't,
Go
see-
ahead.
I can't seem to send the chat. It keeps telling me I need another person. I don't know. Anyway, what about RVs and boats?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
What about RV parking and boats? And also the fact about, how is it stated, old, existing developments. So I live in a neighborhood that basically you couldn't, even if you took out every fourth house, get up to these requirements, realistically. But the other.
You're cutting out a bit, Genevieve. We got the start of your question, which was, it sounds like you're asking about boat and RV parking in your neighborhood. And then I heard something about, how to bring the existing developments into under the requirements. It cut out for the rest. I guess to answer that is that whatever's built now that was under the old code, so this would mostly apply to new developments or extensive redevelopments. So it's a forward thinking look to apply to these new developments, but it wouldn't suddenly apply to everything that's built now.
And specific to residential subdivisions, folks storing their camper trailers, RVs, side by sides, things like that. That's an allowable accessory use. You can store those in your side setback or in your backyard as needed.
If it's more of a commercial scale development, you're providing RV parking, there's actually a standard in Title 21 for the dimensional size of it, for our new development. Well, do we have other hands up? Oh, okay, go ahead.
The bicycle requirements looks like traditional bicycles. Do unencumbered bicycles fall in the same category?
Unencumbered, so
The kind that are
catch me up.
sit down and,
Recumbent?
Oh, recumbent.
yeah,
So, I think that these, probably the dimensional standards are really designed for these standard bicycles. I do not know how they would work with a recumbent. I would hope that the recumbent could still lock to the, I don't really know the answer to that question. And bikes are also getting longer. There's folks buying bicycles that really allow you to bring your groceries home. They're longer. They have a basket and whatnot. And I would claim that these bike parking dimensional standards accommodate those longer bikes. That 6 feet will get a little bit short for your really big bikes. But that's only a minimum. Everyone's welcome to provide better bike parking than a minimum. So, that's a good question. There's a lot of different types of vehicles that are coming out, and not all those are worked into our design.
Yeah, it's a really good question. When we're looking at the size of parking spaces, do we plan for the 10% that won't fit in the parking space, or do we plan for the 75% that will, 90% that will? So there's going to be a lot of these larger bicycles or non-motorized that's at this transportation that may have trouble fitting in these spots, but the vast majority of bicycles should be able to fit in those spots.
If there's something about accommodating one of these other vehicles that really leads you to need to design the rack differently, that doesn't meet the letter of the standard, go to that administrative adjustments provision we mentioned earlier in the bike parking section, or even within the standards itself, it allows the director to adjust the standards to meet your needs. Well, why don't we take a five or so minute, 5-10 minute break and head off into driveways after that. And what time would that bring us back here?
It's 12:58 now, so 12:03, 12:04, should we say?
All right, how about we even it out, 12:05, we'll come back for the exciting second half of this show here. So driveways, and pedestrian frontage standards. Thanks, everybody. 12:05. 1:05. Not 12.
Oh, yeah.
You know, so.
All right.
Okay, they're saying. So, I think, yeah, it sounds like they can hear you now.
All right, someone played a practical joke, and muted us. But here we are for the second half of the parking and site access amendments. Some big changes in some of the other standards. Tom Davis, Long Range Planning, Elizabeth Appleby with current planning division, and Ryan Yell, Long Range Planning Division Manager. So once again, please go ahead and ask questions in the chat, mute your microphone. We'll get to a question and answer period after the driveway section, and then also after the pedestrian frontage standards section. And have an opportunity to get some questions answered there. But before we go into the driveways, Elizabeth, did you want to
Yeah,
mention something we learned? We were a bit ignorant about one part of the rationale behind the ADA parking requirements in response to a question about ADA we got.
so we were asked, where the increase for the municipal ADA standards came from. We had mentioned that it was, added in the S version by the assembly. We got a little bit more background on that, so, there were some community members who wanted to see it, but it's also based on the number of. Oh, so sorry, I think someone just was unmuted. It was based on the number of people disabled in your community. So, I guess the federal requirements are the bare minimum, but they don't necessarily reflect the number of people who actually have a disability in the community. So that was the assembly's rationale for adding it into the S version is, it would better match the percentage of people who actually have a disability in the community.
It is something that I think us staff need to learn about more, become better informed about. So in the site access amendments, the second ordinance is adopted in July. Becomes effective in January 1, are some changes to your on-site vehicle circulation requirements. First of all is the reorganization. So for those of you who are very familiar with Title 21, currently a lot of those driveway standards are in a section called H8 in the parking section. And they're sort of just this randomly organized set of standards. If you are a residential developer, you also know that there are driveway and alley access standards off in the residential design standards. So you're having to look at both sections. What we've done is adopted a change that one of the biggest changes is organizational. And so the on-site vehicle access standards are from H8 are now broken out into a set of subsections that you follow a sequence from the general site planning level down to the details of your driveway design and the design details. So you go from the general H8 sets what regulations apply, reminds you to look at the municipal driveway standards document, et cetera. Establishes generally where your driveways and site access will be on your site, how to understand regulations for that, and it moves towards the detail elements. And that's how those work. There's a lot that doesn't change in those driveway requirements, so we're not covering those. And so you're still looking to the municipal driveway standards or state of Alaska, if you're on a state street, regarding a lot of the requirements about where your driveway can be, that general site planning standard. One of those general standards that is changing is the residential alley access requirement. It isn't going away, it's radically increasing, but some adjustments worth being aware of are being made. First of all, for those of you who are familiar, in some parts of town where their neighborhoods have alleys, if your development has alley access, it really limits the width of your driveway. And if you're multifamily development, you don't get a front driveway. Current code, or, yeah, current code, still in effect now. As of January, that's gonna shift. So, first of all, it's the alley access requirement is going to apply in more areas than it currently does. It's the assembly really emphasized that if it's a multifamily or commercial district in Anchorage, there's alleys that those areas should follow the standards. Currently, it's really focused on neighborhoods like South Addition, Spinola, Fairview, the old urban neighborhoods. But the standard will apply in more areas on January 1. So watch out for that. Secondly, the standard is becoming a little less unfair to your multifamily developments is that the multifamily can, like a single family or two family, have a front driveway. So as before, the front driveway is very limited. It's only 12 feet wide, but it's now something that you can have a one front driveway regardless of the size of your residential development or type of land use. So no arbitrary differences in how much driveways you're seeing in the picture, depending on whether those blue buildings are, three plexes, four plexes, five plexes, single family. There's a driveway every 50 feet, standard width lot, excuse me. Another piece of flexibility is if it is 2 units or more, that corner lot you're seeing there, it can have a driveway, a second driveway on the side street. There it is. It does become tighter in one way, and that's the exceptions. We're getting a wider driveway or more driveways. That has become an administrative variance. Administrative variance is a process. It's in Title 21, there in that section reference. And it's used for only a handful of situations, dumpster screening and a few other things. We've added one specifically for this. So to get an exception, get a wider than that 12-foot driveway or 4 driveways in the front, you go to that section in Chapter 3 of Title 21. A change from before. Single family and two family are not eligible for the exception. If you're single family or two family, it's 1 12-foot driveway. The rest of the driveways need to be in the back, in the alley. That's the way it works. There's always the variance. But for the administrative variance, only multifamily and townhouses. In those cases, it's really where the physical circumstances are really, the applicant really demonstrates that this is really, it's unworkable. And the traffic engineer must determine that improving the alley isn't feasible, or it's a traffic hazard. So the exception is tighter. The urban design result on this street down at the bottom of the screen is regardless of the housing type, there's a consistent pattern of how many driveways there are. So you don't have a lot of driveways for one type of use, none for the other. Now you have a more consistent pattern of how many driveways and how wide, how often. Lots of great parking in that slide. It's all in the alley. So moving along towards from the general towards the specific in these sections, We have a standard that results from the removal of parking minimums. You have a house, you don't really need a minimum parking requirement. Typically, before, you would almost always have a situation that you'd have a required parking stall in front of the garage. And that would always be required to be a 20-foot stall, but now there's no stall required. So can the garage just be closer to the street? So in this standard, we set the length, the setback for a street-facing garage door to be equal to the standard parking space. So currently 18 feet. Maybe it'll become 19. The basketball's sort of in play. We don't know where that's going to land on January 1 or in January. But to make sure that, you know, in the picture here, you see the vehicle on the side street hanging out into the sidewalk, hanging out in the street. It does allow by right a smaller setback for that garage door. If you put up a no parking sign, or the traffic engineer can also make changes. So the alley facing garage door, like the alley facing parking space, we want to be set back 4 feet from the alley. So typical Anchorage alley is 20 feet wide. That 4 feet gives us back our 24-foot wide drive aisle. So 4-foot setback for that turning and maneuvering ability. For those of us like me are professional drivers. So now we're moving towards access to parking spaces. So your individual parking space, you're always, you know, you always want to be able to do that two movement, two turn. What to call it? It's, you know, you pull in and out of a parking space, you have a certain movement to make, and all of that movement of your car is taking place on site, not in the street. So Anchorage is still recovering from development types that would, you know, create a row of parking stalls along your sidewalk, kind of affect the function and the character of your neighborhood. And that, of course, in current Title 21 and in the amendments is not generally what we like to see. So the vehicle maneuvering takes place on site so that the vehicle is always coming onto the street or off the street, moving in a forward motion, and you don't have rows of parking stalls along the street. Which is why generally we really only exempted single family and two family uses from the standard. We do in current Title 21, the amendments do the same. It's an outright exemption, single family and two family. So for better or worse, those uses are exempt. Currently, if you're any other use, you don't have that exemption. The traffic engineer has the ability to give you an exception, and I believe often does. But there's no by right way for a multifamily development, triplex or above, to have the same kind of driveway as a single family home like. 2018, we had the Fairview Compact Design Competition, and the winning design entry and several other design entries featured single family style driveway on the front street, just as if it were a single family home. A narrow, where one or two parking spaces could back out into the street. So in the amendments, we have created a by right exception and have tried to manage that for scale so that this exception is by right, but it's the mountain size of it is controlled so it has no more impacts on the neighborhood than a single family home. So if you're a triplex or fourplex or above, if you're commercial, if you're on a local street, local classification street, you have a parking area with 1 or 2 spaces, or 4 spaces tandem, and it's only 20 feet wide or less, that is a by right option to have that offsite maneuvering. So that's a change from current code. That's January 1. As before, the traffic engineer for 3 and 4 plexes has to approve the powers to approve additional spaces, wider. You know, where you have, maybe it's a dead end street or it's the wide end of a cul-de-sac or other situation where they can, they have that administrative ability to allow for more 3 and 4 plexes. Another change is that currently the traffic engineer must approve any spaces that back into an alley. So that's also becoming by right, simply by right. Parking spaces can back into an alley. Again, we just want to make sure that the drive aisle space, effective improved portion of the alley is, typically 20 feet or less. We want to make sure that the on-site setback, the parking stall recreates that 24-foot wide drive aisle. So you see that row of parking stalls there? There's no number, there's no magic number above which the traffic engineer can say, okay, you got to stop. So getting further into the driveway section, now we're getting more into the details, the design and the dimensional standards for driveways. And we're going to begin with maximum driveway width. We're going to talk a little bit about minimum driveway width and a few other things. So the first thing about the maximum driveway width is that it's really, the amendments are really clarifying what's there already, or attempting to clarify what's there already. What's there already is generally what a lot of us call the 2/5 rule. That the driveways can take up no more than 40% of the width of the frontage. That's not changing. And that's a big not change, right? That there's a lot of discussion about the maximum driveway requirement. On the one hand, you have people in the community expressing what an impact that is to our streets, function, snow storage, pedestrian function, that wide driveways are really, they're taking away right of way. Okay. On the other hand, there is the issue where the driveway width maxes out at 33% or 40% of the lot frontage within the right of way. And then as the driveway widens because the property owner wants more parking area. And so we apply the standard in the right of way. The driveway on the property is wider, and they just come in and they use it as the wider section as driveway anyway. Maybe they add gravel or they make other changes. And it's really in a lot of cases doesn't work well. So this amendment didn't go into trying to resolve that issue because we believe that's a huge discussion to figure out that there's plenty of other improvements to make. So admittedly, we did not, so to speak, go there. What we did do was so some of us dummies like me, I never really understood that the municipal driveway standards really only applied in the right of way, which is something I didn't realize for years. So what I've done for folks like me is to clarify and define something called the driveway approach, which is just laying out clearly that municipal driveway standards, including this 2/5 rule, apply in the driveway approach portion of your driveway, which is the portion of your driveway that's in the right of way, not on property. Once you get on property, there is no driveway maximum width. There isn't now, and there won't be in January. A lot of these exceptions are really the same. The maximum driveway width section in the residential design standards is merged, so you don't have to go to the residential design standards section anymore. It's all right here in the main driveway section. The exceptions are similar or the same as before. They're just merged for both residential and commercial uses. There's may seem like a nuance, but the word more in the third bullet, at the bottom, the traffic engineer may approve more than the minimum driveway width. If it's demonstrated to them that some of the issues with driveway width are addressed by the applicant. And back to the residential alley access, just have to remember that there is a maximum driveway width where you have alleys, right? It's 12 feet. There's a clarification or further emphasis when you're in one of the neighborhoods that the ordinance defines as urban, that there is a stronger emphasis on when you create a new driveway curb cut to maintain, restore as level a sidewalk as possible. Title 21 doesn't have currently a minimum driveway width section. It's adding one, and it's really adding one for two reasons. It's clarifying that there are regulations out there that have a minimum driveway width requirement. So it's creating a bit of a little clearinghouse for you to remind you where to go for the minimum width of parking aisles and your parking bay. Reminding you the municipal driveway standards have set the minimum width of your driveway approach. And I believe, in your driveway approach, and then some other basic references and reminders. The second thing it does is it sets some new minimum driveway widths for residential driveways, multi-unit driveways. These are by right minimum widths. And they apply where apply along local streets. And these by right minimum widths override the municipal driveway standards, where the driveway standards have a different minimum. These minimums override in the code. And I think the most important ones that we wanted to add were the bottom two in that table. So for a multi-unit project or any residential project, providing a driveway access for up to 10 parking spaces, like a typical 3-plex or 4-plex, or even, if you only have one parking space per unit, even up to a 10-plex. But if the driveway is providing access for up to only 10 spaces, the minimum required width of that driveway is 12 feet, including in the driveway approach on the property. Straight driveway segments on the property can get down to 10 feet. Two-way driveway, two-way traffic, same thing. It's still just the 10 to 12 feet. So no longer requiring a two-way driveway. So that can save a lot of space on the site. That's a by right minimum. And then the last row, for when there are more than 10 parking spaces, it provides the option to keep the 12 feet if it's one-way traffic. You don't really have to argue with the traffic engineer about it. Typically, they would probably provide it anyhow, but just understand now moving forward that if it's a one-way traffic for a larger residential parking facility, that you can get that 12 feet for one-way traffic and just 20 feet for two-way by right. In all of this, the traffic engineer, of course, still has the ability to provide further adjustments. And so visualizing that, you might have a multifamily building, there's your 10 parking stalls in the back and your 10-foot driveway on site.
No questions in the chat time.
So the driveway section, there's a lot of moving around, a lot of reorganizing. but there was a lot that wasn't changed. A lot of adjusting. The last section today has to do with the part of the site access amendments ordinance adopted this past July. It becomes effective in January, which addresses how buildings, sites oriented to pedestrian access. And so there are a number of elements to this. And this is a new subsection of the Chapter 7 transportation section. It's a new subsection that comes just after the pedestrian walkway and sidewalk requirements. That is called pedestrian frontage standard. And it has the objectives to facilitate developments that choose to take the approach of making access to the building as convenient for the pedestrian as it is for the folks coming in by car. As you see it as Walgreens on Huffman Town Center area that is pulled closer to the street and that the sidewalk is not through a parking lot as opposed to the Walgreens there in the far right at South Diamond Boulevard. That the development is grading the street with entries near the street, some windows, as opposed to the development there in DeBar, the older building there with the that backs up to DeBar Road. The frontage standards are also substantially reorganizing how Title 21 presents these kinds of standards. And radically simpler and more consistent. And it's a pretty large organizational change. The section has some objectives. Once again, when you read a new section, it's worth reading the purpose statement. I'll provide you with the rationale behind it. But it includes pedestrian access, safety, and greeting the street with developments that frame the public street as a positive public space. This is a diagram of the change organizationally. And the new section merges, consolidates, boils down a lot of regulation so that the currently what you might see is 10 to 12 pages worth of different regulations in different parts of code are boiling down to a single one-page table. And that single one-page table has support from applicability exemptions page and then some measurement rules. How do you measure that are often another part of code? So it's an attempt to relocate and consolidate. It's also an attempt to reframe or clarify why we have standards like window requirements, visible entries, and all this and that. That it was never meant to be about aesthetics necessarily. That it really is about how it functions and it relates it to transportation. This slide just provides you with a rundown of some of the deleted sections. So few of you have done mixed use developments. There are some standards that have been deleted and replaced from Chapter 4, district specific standards. Many of you, who do residential development are familiar with the multifamily design standards. So we're removing, 7 pages or so from that section. They're going away. And then, for single family and two family. For single family and two family, once this amendment becomes effective, there really aren't any building design standards for single family in the residential design standards anymore. I think all that's left is a mixed housing model standard. So there's some, most of those 11 pages, being deleted in the slide are in those sections. The pedestrian frontage standard has 2 sets of standards. One applies in neighborhoods that we see as more urban. They have more people. And another set of standards applies in the more, for lack of a better word, suburban, lower density, single family areas. And so Title 21 with these amendments defines urban neighborhood context. And it's that those areas are defined by zoning districts. So generally your multifamily and your commercial zoning districts, where there is more activity. That there's a set of standards, the pedestrian frontage standards apply to those. And I'm not sure if it's the B1B.
I thought it was,
Oh, is
I copied it right from
Okay,
the ordinance.
all right. The assembly, originally the ordinance focused this standard on South Addition and some neighborhoods identified in the Anchorage 2040 plan. It's very pedestrian oriented street layouts where the higher standard would apply in those areas. The assembly determined that this stronger urban neighborhood context standard or the pedestrian frontage standards really needs to be applied more broadly to give more areas the benefit of this more pedestrian friendly standard. And so they did expand it to include all of those zoning districts. During that effort, they inadvertently removed a few parts of South Addition and some of these older neighborhoods from that are in and within those neighborhoods. And so we've been working with the assembly to bring forward a kind of a patch, a cleanup amendment to re-include some of those neighborhood areas that they were really thinking about when they made that change. Some of these zoning districts, the second part of that patch, some of these zoning districts include areas that are on hillside or in Chugiak. They have special limitations at cell districts that they're really effectively single family or low density districts. Some areas without sewer water service. We believe the assembly wasn't really meaning to include those areas in the urban standard. And so the second part of the patch is to exempt those areas. So this is the format of the pedestrian frontage standard. The 11 pages moved into 1 page. It is a table and an accompanying diagram, just a reference. So in the table, each row has a capitalized letter. It covers a different site feature element. Those capitalized letters are, shown in the illustration diagram. It's just a quick view help. This table is for the urban neighborhood context that I described. For the rest of the town, there's a second table. For any given development, only 1 table applies. So it's not a 2-table problem for you. It's 1 table. And depending on where you are in town, it's either This table 2, which is chapter 7, table 2, which is for the urban neighborhood context, or 3 for the other areas. The tables are identical in that they cover the same features, they set same basic standards, but in the right-hand column, in the urban neighborhoods, the standard tends to be strong, more pedestrian oriented. And they both refer to that illustration. So we'll cover A through G briefly. Some of those will be familiar to you. They're kind of reformatted versions of a lot that was in the residential design standards to simplify. So the site element, the setup is in the left, the standard is in the right, with some exceptions or explanation at the bottom. That one-page table is supported by an applicability section, about a page long. So the standard applies throughout the Muni, except in certain areas. Girdwood, the Tourniquet Arm District, the Eagle River Downtown Overlay Zone, the Clute Overlay Zone, and in downtown Anchorage, the DT, the B, the Central Business District zones of downtown. It does not apply in your institutional or industrial zones, and generally doesn't apply to most development in the large lot rural zones. Existing buildings, changes of use, has to be a pretty dramatic change to the building for this pedestrian frontage standard to kick in. I think this is carrying forward and reflects an exemption for the residential design standards and strengthens that. And then other exemptions that I think carried over from the standards we've migrated from other sections. We have added some ability to make administrative relief. So the standards that are migrated over from other sections, there's actually more administrative relief or flexibility. The first of the standards, first of the site elements is the location of parking relative to where the building is. The goal here is to limit the amount of the space in front of the building that's devoted to parking. So get the building, out from behind the parking. Doesn't set a maximum setback. It just is a parking placement where the parking is located. So in this slide here, or in this illustration here, you see this development that most of the facade is not behind parking. There's a portion of the facade setback where some of the parking stalls are dipping into. So the standard is providing the ability for some of the building to be behind parking, but a good portion of it grading the street. In the urban neighborhoods, that's at least half of that facade width, or what we call the building elevation, right? The building elevation drawing. Half of that width of the front of the building, and that building elevation drawing is, not behind parking or circulation areas. We have some exceptions. In the urban neighborhoods, on lots with alley access, following up on what we were talking about before, there really is no parking or circulation allowed in front of the building except in the driveway we were talking about, the 12-foot driveway for individual dwellings. So with the alley access, it becomes a very strict urban standard. In the second table, for all those areas, the outlying parts of the city, there's also a standard that applies. This standard is is a change. It's a reform of, some elements of the residential design standards and mixed use development standards, but it's a new kind of form for those. So it is, probably the biggest substantive difference from before. So it's something that, goes part and parcel with removing parking minimums. We really are attempting to create a more pedestrian friendly city moving forward. A second site feature is, very familiar to you, and it is really, moving an existing regulations regarding, how wide your garage entrance can be relative to the rest of your residence, and how far ahead in front that driveway can project. And in, the first item 1 here in the urban neighborhoods, there is a reduction in the allowed garage width from current code. Current code being around 2/3 or 67%. There is an exception for some types of housing in the R2 two-family zones. There's also a stronger restriction on how far the garage may project out front. If that's cut in half, whereas before the garage would project out further, now it's a distance to equal to no more than half the width of the rest of the building elevation. In the other neighborhoods in that second table, standard is unchanged. For multifamily, in the current code, it's being removed. The standard is 67%, but it's a menu choice, and there are alternatives to that. Other things that the multi-unit development can do besides the 67%. And that's changing into a standard. For single family, two family, it was a standard. Stay standard. So it's really beginning to treat all residential dwelling types a bit more consistently with the basic standards. Third side element, the street facing window requirement. So in the urban neighborhoods, it's ratcheting it up by about 5%. In the rest of the areas, it's retaining the existing standard and actually relaxing it a bit on the secondary frontage. And I believe even in the urban areas in the secondary frontage, the standard isn't increasing over current. So the percentage of the wall area, that's either the windows or the entrances, is increasing to 15% for residences in the urban neighborhoods. It's currently 10, it's increasing to 10%. To 15%, excuse me. For mixed use buildings, currently 15%, increasing to 25%. Ground floor commercial facade. Currently, a non-residential building, commercial building, there is no standard. In the amendments, the commercial buildings will begin to fall under the same standards as the mixed-use buildings. So we're not treating single-use commercial buildings with favor over mixed-use and residential buildings. It's becoming more consistent. And in the other neighborhoods, commercial buildings are also becoming subject to standards. Again, the same standard as applies to the mixed-use buildings. The mixed-use buildings, these standards have been in Chapter 4. Now that, everything's coming to this area. So there is a more consistent window and entry requirement. And the rules for how to measure window area as a percentage of the wall area are being consolidated in a one-stop place in the Title 21 Rules of Interpretation. They're right, how do you measure distance? How do you round fractions, everything else? But this is, how do you measure window area? We're providing an example illustration. So that also will go into effect. So throughout Title 21, even in Girdwood, there's a window requirement. And the Eagle River downtown overlay, there's a window requirement. Those areas, they don't have any instructions for how to measure window area. There's a good amount of instruction in the residential design standards. That's great. There's a little bit in the mixed use. They're a little bit different from one another. Now it's all in one place. It's generally available. And it's unchanged. It's with respect to the residential design standards, it's not changed. We didn't change the parts of the building that are exempt, for example. But they're just becoming more general applicable. The next site element is the visible primary entrances, and for residences, visible and sheltered primary entrances. On the residential side of the house, in Title 21 residential design standards, there's a set of standards called entryway treatment that apply in your townhouse and multifamily buildings. And then off in the single family, two family, there's standards for primary entrances, different. They're slightly different from one another, but they're very similar with respect to shelter. So what we did was we applied applied the less stringent sheltering standard, which incidentally happened to be for the multifamily townhouse, and merged those standards and basically made it a bit simple. Multifamily really got kind of lengthy. For the non-residential, it becomes more flexible. For the mixed-use development, there's a standard. So it's becoming more flexible, and as before, if it's a standalone commercial building, it's going to now be under the same standards. So we're not favoring that Walgreens over your townhouses, or you do the right thing and you develop a mixed-use building and you're hit with standards, but single-use commercial building is not. That idea is going away. When we reformatted the visible entrance requirement, there's a way that we're clarifying. What we're proposing is an amendment to clarify that there's no intent for it to have to face the street. This isn't a street-facing entrance requirement. The idea is it's visible. The wayfinding to it. If it's on a common open space, it doesn't have to be visible from the street. The adjustment also includes clarifying that the common open space itself doesn't need to be visible from the street. So it's an attempt to clarify that just with wording. The reform standard, there's a way you can read it two ways, but there is a way to read it that some of our zoning review staff read it, and it read to them like every primary entrance on the site needs to be visible. Wasn't the intent. The intent was really to bring forward the standard for how many of the primary entrances on the site must comply. So we have another fix-it amendment coming forward to clarify, how many entrances really need to comply with this standard. Not all. So if you have a townhouse project, you have some of your buildings in the back, but there's a certain number of your primary entrances that don't need to follow or worry about this requirement. The very last slide about the pedestrian amenities is, the last site feature on the pedestrian frontage table, which is, a requirement to select, an amenity or two amenities from the existing pedestrian amenities menu in Title 21, sort of a one-stop catch-all menu of certain types of facilities and standards for them. So in the urban areas, we're asking that multifamily developments and commercial developments select two amenities from this menu. And in the outlying areas, one. The menu is quite long. We've made it longer in the right-hand column. This is sort of an outline of it. It's in order, but you see that there's 5 or 6 items that are new. Many of these were brought over from the residential design standards or other locations. The intent is to provide more choices, more options for how to satisfy this. But the idea is to, beyond the minimum walkway, a 5-foot walkway, beyond the minimum, what 1 or 2 things in addition the development can feature. And some of it is maybe adding more windows or enhancing the primary entrance, or a walkway to the street, not going through the parking lot, which is very easy to comply with if your building isn't in front, your parking lot isn't in front of the building. So there are some things you may be doing as part of your pedestrian-oriented site planning that will automatically trigger some of these. I think it becomes, you have to pay more attention to this menu, the more your building is set back behind parking. That's where you're having to figure out which one of these you could add. But I think if you're really focusing on pedestrian-oriented site planning, that you're gonna start hitting the check marks on a lot of these without too much thought. That's the idea. Oh, no, I just did. In the lower right, alternative equivalent compliance is available in that menu as well. So it's not intended to be, just paint by color by number, that you can propose other ways to enhance the pedestrian facilities on the site through our existing equivalent compliance procedure, which is built into your review approval process. And that is the part of the pedestrian amenities, and the pedestrian frontage standards are just a part of this overall change in emphasis, that these amendments are taking Title 21 away from parking minimums and more attempting to prime the pump for the pedestrian, bicyclist, and other ways to get around. But I think that ends the show here. We're all working together. And questions?
Read Title 21, I mean, in the past, it's, well, I don't know, what, 15 years ago, and it comes to that. And as online, between sections, this section, there's another section, there's another section. That can be moved up and down.
Yeah, so are you referring to how the Title 21 standards are organized overall?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, right. So, with respect to the development design standards, it does feel like we've dissected the frog, and you thinking about lighting, and you go to the lighting section. You think about landscape, you go to the landscaping section. But there's a little bit about landscaping in the residential section. That, some of that was intended and some of it, the general layout. There has been a effort with respect to the downtown standards to provide, a one-stop set of standards for those districts, right? So downtown's chapter offers the developer somewhat better experience in the sense that they can go to one chapter and have more of their standards. And some codes have moved towards that even for the residential zones, commercial zones, where the standards are more, organized away from the user's perspective. Title 21 rewrite was really organized from a kind of there's a method to the madness, but it wasn't quite that way. And, this is a pretty big amendment, parking and site access. It's a pretty big amendment. It's probably arguably the largest since we rewrote the code. But I can't claim that it's changed the entire overall code in its organization. And to some degree, it's had to work within that existing structure. We're hoping that it improves it somewhat in that, for example, the pedestrian standards are now in one location. The parking, the driveway and circulation standards are also more consolidated. But we are still admittedly in that same overall structure at this point. And I think the hardest part about it will be the surprise. That's the hardest part, is the change, the shift. There are some folks who didn't attend today, didn't get their continuing education credits, and may not be aware. And what we're hoping is that folks are aware of change is coming. It's been adopted, and that we're trying to make sure folks are aware of it as they're preparing for the 2024 season.
Was this all initiated because of the couple of assembly members that wanted to go down to two zones?
This really was initiated we started working the groundwork report in 2018. Well, it came out of the comprehensive plan, and
I was starting before that.
it's much before that, and it really is isn't really addressing how many zoning districts we have. Yes.
So I just want to say thank you to you and the department, because this is very exciting to me. This is something that we need to address. A lot of things that I felt was misplaced. Actually, something that's the design standards and doing a rewrite for 2011. I remember having a conversation with you probably 8 years ago, but I was just about that, and we were describing this different purposes that you wanted to get to. And it seems like you're going, so thank you.
All right, I don't remember that conversation.
But I just was it's exciting.
All right, thank you.
There is a question in the chat, or maybe a comment. It was just asking about the menu of the pedestrian design standards. Asked if we could consider adding like a few smaller, more achievable items to the list for additional open space, or additional bike parking towards the menu. It's from Tyler Robinson, so we could also just follow up with him individually too on that comment in the pedestrian amenities menu.
Yeah, some of those new items are an attempt to move in that direction. Enhancements to your primary entrance, the right-hand column, separated walkway to the street, that I don't, take the apartment building on 32nd Avenue that we showed, the CHA building, that walkway to the front entrance is separated from the parking lot. So you check the box there. And, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if that facade also gets you the enhanced facade transparency. It could be wrong, but, so hopefully there's some of those elements already in there. You know, that, until there are amendments and folks come forward with additional suggestions, you know, the alternative equipment compliance is there for you in the meantime, but, of course, we're all ears for, you know, additional achievable items that match the scale of your development. Yeah. So, yeah, thank you for that question.
I don't see any other questions in the chat or anyone having their hand raised online.
Okay.
Well, I guess one additional thing I'll add too is just talking about the alternative equipment compliance entitlement. So it's something that we're really hoping folks utilize more often, because we do recognize that although we've provided a fairly extensive list of amenities to choose from, we realize that these aren't fixes to everything in every situation. So if there is an alternative design that you feel would meet the intent or function of these, we would like to see those designs. And alternative equipment compliance currently has no application fee. It's approved by the planning director. And I do understand there's a little bit of risk with that, because there's relying on a potentially subjective approval, but it is a way to build in design flexibility to still meet code requirements, because we realize we can't account for every situation out there.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for your time. It's been very long, period, and I hope that you guys earn some kind of credit and get some benefit out of this. We will, make sure before we close down the meeting to, make sure we've somehow recorded or make sure we have a list of the folks who, are here and online, so that, you need to get credit to your chapter that you received that. Yeah, okay. If you have any other questions or comments, send them to Elizabeth and myself, and we try to get a response to you. There have been some questions we've received about the cleanup amendments, and we're be getting those responses out as quickly as possible. And those will be coming to the assembly, we hope, in December. We're racing to get those into the system so that the assembly can introduce that. The idea being that all those patches and fixes are in place for you in January when the rest of this becomes effective. So, all right, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for those who came in person, and for those of you who patched in online. So, all right, take care, and thank you. Thank you.